Since the Europeans had discovered the Americas in the 1490s, they had been exploring, conquering and colonizing the newfound continent for the next few centuries. By the 18th century, North America had been colonized by Britain, France and Spain. In 1754, a war began between France and Britain over disputed territories in North America. It spilled over into a colonial war across the world and ultimately led to the British forces defeating the French, who'd been helped by several Native American tribes. Great Britain had won the war but was left heavily in debt. At this time, many generations had been living in America. This was their home. Britain decided to tax the American colonists for the first time, but they refused to pay tax as they didn't have representation in the British Parliament by their rights as Englishmen.
Right, so in 1765, the British government was like, hey, since we went into this debt to get you all this new land, we trust that you won't mind if we pass the Stamp Act, in which we place a fancy stamp on your documents, newspapers, playing cards, etc., and in return, you give us money. Well, it turns out the colonists weren't so keen on this, not so much because the tax was high, but because they had no direct representation in the parliament that had levied the tax. And plus, they were cranky about the crown keeping large numbers of British troops in the colonies even after the end of the 7 Years' War. And then the British government was like, you are inadequately grateful, and the colonists were like, shut up, we hate you, and the British government was like, as long as you live under our roof, you live by our rules, and so on. But eventually the British backed down and repealed the Stamp Act. The repeal inspired a line of commemorative teapots, thereby beginning America's storied tradition of worthless collectible ceramics. But in the end, this only emboldened the colonists when the British tried to put new taxes on the Americans in the form of the Townshend Act. These led to further protests and boycotts, and most importantly, more organization among the colonists. The protests escalated. 1770 saw the Boston Massacre, which with its sum total of 5 dead was perhaps the least massacre of all time. And in 1773, a bunch of colonists dumped about $1 million worth of tea into Boston Harbor in protest of British government decisions that actually would have made British tea cheaper.
In 1774, Britain punished Massachusetts with a series of acts to control the colony and placed its own royal governor to take charge. But the people set up their own provincial congress. Britain was in control of Boston, but the Americans had control of the countryside, as they began organizing and training militias. American patriot leaders from 12 of the 13 colonies came together and convened the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia. They petitioned the king, wanting rid of the taxes and the royal governors, claiming that British Parliament had no place in internal American affairs, but they were happy to agree to the trade regulations. The British response, however, was more and more regulations, restrictions, and an increased army presence. In February 1775, Massachusetts was declared to be in a state of rebellion by the British Parliament. By April, the British commander, Lieutenant General Thomas Gage, was ordered to disarm the rebels and arrest their leaders. Paul Revere and other riders rode through the night ahead of the British forces to warn the leaders in Lexington and Concord. By the time the British reached Lexington, militia were waiting for them. The first shots were fired and the militiamen fell back to Concord. The British followed them to be met by 500 militiamen. The overwhelmed British forces fell back in retreat and the war had begun. The militia chased them back to Boston and besieged the city. The Second Continental Congress of all 3 colonies came together to organize the war effort. The militias were to be reorganized into the Continental Army, with Congressman George Washington appointed as their general. The 13 colonies organized revolutionary governments and began to expel the royal governors, taking control for themselves. British reinforcements led by General William Howe landed across from Boston and captured the Charlestown Peninsula in the Battle of Bunker Hill, but at a high cost of life, but they were unable to break the siege. The King of England issued a proclamation of rebellion urging the British forces to quell the patriots. They began recruiting from Britain and Ireland and even hired Hessian mercenaries from the Holy Roman Empire. General Washington arrived at the siege of Boston the following month to take charge. Despite a shortage of munitions and gunpowder, the siege lasted through the Ottoman winter, the British failing to press any advantage. The Continental Army also pressed into British-controlled Quebec to try and get the French-speaking Canadians on their side, but the British forces ultimately pushed them back. By March 1776, General Washington had gathered cannons and placed them on the hills overlooking Boston. The British chose to evacuate and head for Halifax in Nova Scotia. Knowing it would make a great naval base for the British, General Washington moved his forces down to New York City to defend it. General Howe's British forces landed close by on Staten Island in June. Meanwhile, the Congress were formally establishing a document explaining their position. Congressman Thomas Jefferson first drafted what became the Declaration of Independence, and it was ratified on the 4th of July, 1776. It declared that the 13 colonies were to be recognized as no longer part of the British Empire. They were to become known as a new nation, the United States of America. By August, General Howe's forces were ready to attack. Washington divided his troops between Manhattan and Long Island, but the British forces managed to flank them. The American forces forces were ultimately driven out of New York in defeat. The British forces saw American prisoners as traitors and not prisoners of war, and thus treated them as such. They kept them in prison ships in New York, and more Americans died of neglect and disease in these ships than in the rest of the war. Washington's forces escaped through New Jersey, across the Delaware River to Pennsylvania. Howe chose not to follow them, even though American forces were dwindling into the winter. Congress fled Philadelphia in despair with the British forces moving closer. Howe spread his forces thin throughout New Jersey, and General Washington decided to attack before the end of the year. He stealthily crossed the River Delaware at night, at Christmas, and surprised 1,000 Hessian mercenaries at Trenton. After a few more American victories, General Howe conceded most of New Jersey to General Washington, despite his greater numbers. Washington took it easy for the rest of the winter, while militia continued to attack small British forces. Throughout 1777, a British force under General Burgoyne pushed down from Quebec to try to cut off New England from the other colonies. It was a tough campaign, but was ultimately stopped at Saratoga, New York, by American forces under Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold. Burgoyne hoped for help from Howe, but he'd sailed his forces south to take Philadelphia. Burgoyne surrendered. Howe outmaneuvered Washington and captured Philadelphia. Washington spent that winter in Valley Forge, where his force lost many men through cold and disease. Howe had sent his resignation and chose not to attack. During 1777 also, Congress officially adopted their new flag. To stop the British from growing more powerful, France officially declared their allegiance with the Americans and their struggle for independence in 1778. The British offered that the colonies could go back to the way they were, pre-tax, pre-war allegiance to the crown. They were rejected. On the sea, as usual, Britain had the superior fleet, while the Americans relied on privateering to grow their non-existent fleet. Sir Henry Clinton took over from Howe and moved his forces back up to New York as the French navy approached. The British had armed many Native American tribes and loyalists to fight against the colonists, so George Washington ordered the Sullivan expedition to burn down Iroquois and loyalist crops and villages. In 1779, Spain officially entered the war on the side of the Americans. French and Spanish threats elsewhere in the world, such as the West Indies, were forcing the British to remove soldiers from North America. The war in the North ultimately slowed to a stalemate. The British then looked south. Clinton left New York to hopefully get a stronger foothold in the south and more support from loyalists. The winter of 1779 was even worse for the northern Continental armies. The American armies were falling apart as conditions were terrible and money was worthless. Mutinies broke out in 1780, but militias were able to hold back any British troops trying to press an advantage. By May 1780, Clinton had captured Charleston, South Carolina, and most of the Southern Continental Army along with it. He returned to New York, leaving Lord Cornwallis in charge of the Southern British Army. Up north, the French landed some troops in Rhode Island, but the British Navy stopped any further French landing. Benedict Arnold had been growing disenchanted by the war and defected to the British. Horatio Gates took charge of the remaining American forces in the south, but was defeated at the Battle of Camden, allowing Georgia and South Carolina to fall back under British control. In 1781, Cornwallis continued to push through North Carolina, but his forces were worn down by battles with newly appointed General Nathaniel Greene. Cornwallis retreated his forces to Wilmington, North Carolina, leaving Georgia and South Carolina. By the end of September 1781, the British only controlled Savannah and Charleston in the south. Cornwallis continued his force north into Virginia, where he ultimately set up a base in Yorktown, on a peninsula. The French fleet moved in and fought off the British ships there, cutting off Cornwallis by sea. The combined American and French forces under General Washington and the Comte de Rochambeau moved in and surrounded Cornwallis, who ultimately surrendered his army on October 9, 1781. British reinforcements were sent out from New York that same day, but it was too late. News reached Britain the following month, and the King wanted to continue the war. Fighting against France, Spain and the Dutch Republic was still happening around the world. The Tory Prime Minister Lord North resigned, and power went to the Liberal Whig Party, who recognised American independence and ended the war. The Peace Treaty of Paris was agreed in 1783, and Britain signed over the land to the United States of America. This included Native American land west of the Appalachian Mountains, unknownst to the Native Americans themselves. There would be long and fierce fighting to come over this land. France practically bankrupted itself paying for the war, leading to its own revolution in 1789. The United States would organise itself in the coming decades. They drafted their constitution in 1787 and ratified it in 1788. In 1789, George Washington was unanimously elected the first president of the United States of America. The next year, he chose an area along the Potomac River, roughly halfway down the 13 colonies, to be the new nation's capital, Washington, D.C. The United States of America would grow in many ways to become one of, if not the most powerful country in the world. But it had a long and bumpy road ahead of it, both literally and metaphorically.
But what made it special was that some of its more radical proponents, like Immanuel Kant, for instance, went so far as to argue that human reason rendered a belief in God unnecessary and, by extension, proclaimed that any belief in divine intervention or a divine plan for humanity was just superstition. Given that this was coming out of an overwhelmingly Christian Europe, this was a pretty controversial suggestion, and not all Enlightenment thinkers would go that far. And
I had always believed that the founding fathers of the United States were Christians. American Christians often claim them as such, and I've often heard it preached from American churches. And that isn't the unusual part. When you read the words of the founding fathers, it's easy to come to that conclusion. After all the presidents mention God and give him honor in their inauguration speeches, and there are a myriad of other quotations from early American leaders which highlight their belief in God's supremacy over the nation. The confusing part is that American atheists also claim the founding fathers were atheists, and what is more, they can produce direct quotations of their own to support their position as well. We have this unique situation where the founding fathers have managed to become all things to all men. To atheists, they were atheists. To Christians, they were Christians. Take John Adams, the second President of the United States, for example. He is quoted as saying, "20 times in the course of my late reading have I been upon the point of breaking out. This would be the best of all possible worlds if there were no religion in it." Atheists love that quotation. It was also during his administration that the Treaty of Peace and Friendship was drawn up, which states in Article 11 that the government of the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion. Adams also said, "The divinity of Jesus is made a convenient cover for absurdity. Nowhere in the Gospels do we find a precept for creeds, confessions, oaths, doctrines, and whole cartloads of other foolish trumpery that we find in Christianity." So he didn't have much time for Christianity, right? But then we find him writing in a letter to Thomas Jefferson, "The general principles on which the fathers achieved independence were the principles of Christianity. I will avow that I then believed, and now believe, that those general principles of Christianity are as eternal and immutable as the existence and attributes of God, and that those principles of liberty are as unalterable as human nature." Or what about his letter to F.A. van der Kemp? "Jesus is benevolence personified, an example for all men. The Christian religion, in its primitive purity and simplicity, I have entertained for more than 60 years. It is the religion of reason, equity, and love. It is the religion of the head and the heart." So we have direct quotations that appear to disparage Christianity, and then others that appear to praise it, and it's the same for many other founding fathers. This apparent contradiction can only begin to be ironed out when you consider the time period in which the USA was founded. It was that time of transition in the Enlightenment between faith and science, the time when deism gave people a form of God that was diminished and cloudy, and where people were starting to turn towards science for answers. Where God ended and where science began was still being worked out at that time, and indeed each of the early American leaders had different ideas on that. It's wrong to think that they were all of the exact same mind, all atheists or all Christians. The majority of the founding fathers of the United States stood somewhere between atheism and Christianity. They were in fact mostly deists or slight variations thereof. Many of them were also Freemasons. John Adams was actually a Unitarian, which was an outworking of deism. He believed all religions to be rooted in the truth. Thomas Jefferson, on the other hand, leant far more towards the atheistic end of the scale. The influence of deism explains why many of the early American leaders liked loose terms such as divine providence when referring to God. It's through the fuzziness of deism and the transitional period of that time that the founding fathers of the United States have become all things to all men. They defined the Constitution in both religious and secular terms. There's no doubt they respected many of the ideals of Christianity, and that they were heavily influenced by Christian ideals, mostly believing it to be the best of all religions. But there is also no doubt that many of them refuted Jesus' claim to be God, and denied the outright authority of Christianity above other religions. Benjamin Franklin openly voiced his doubts about the divinity of Jesus, for example. And it's also frustratingly clear when reading the words of the founding fathers that when they referred to the corruption of Christianity, they were in fact thinking of the corrupt Catholic Church. Many of them had fallen into the trap of thinking that Catholicism was a natural outworking of the Bible. It was their bid to escape those oppressive hierarchical systems of Europe that led them to want to water down the Bible and the idea of God. Because of their differing beliefs about where God ended and where science began, they also differed about how much God intervened with his creation. Some thought God did and some thought he didn't. It's exactly because of that cloudy transitional period between God and science that quotes can now be cherry-picked from the Founding Fathers to support both religious and secular worldviews. One true benefit America did have in those early times, however, was the influx of Puritans escaping religious persecution in Europe. Although they are often caricatured today as being plain, boring, and colourless, if the United States has anyone to thank for their Christian heritage and the moral goodness upon which the country was built, it is that people group above anyone else. They too hated the oppressive hierarchical system of Europe, but rather than try to water down God or the Bible, they recognised that the corrupt Catholic system had nothing to do with the Bible at all. They were intent on staying true to what they read in their Geneva Bibles, and I believe it was their godly influence on the nation in those early years, along with the residual influence of the principles of Christianity through the Founding Fathers, that was a major driving force behind America's prosperity and blessing. It's important we establish that.
Even if the government that America's revolutionaries came up with didn't overturn privilege or tear apart the social order as the French Revolution tried to do, it did make significant changes. America made sure that there would never be a formal nobility, except for the Count of Chocula, and it recognized the equal rights of daughters and widows when it came to inheriting and possessing property. Also, it created a world in which future countesses could rehabilitate their reputations in New York. But the real seismic change was that after the Revolution, Americans came to view themselves as equal to each other. And in the context of the 18th century, that was pretty radical. Ordinary Americans came to believe that no one in a basic, down-to-earth and day-in and day-out manner was really better than anyone else. That was equality as no other nation had ever quite had it. And in the end, the ideas of the American Revolution, ideas about property and equality and representation, are still hugely important in shaping political discourse around the world, and particularly in America. That revolutionary ideas and values are not always easy to live up to. Nothing challenges one's belief in equality quite like becoming rich and powerful. Indeed, rare is the revolutionary who doesn't become on some level like Orwell's pigs, insisting that while all animals were created equal, some were created more equal than others. In short, if you're going to base your new society on philosophy, you should try to found it on ideals that are as inclusive and humanistic as possible, because the people executing those ideas will never be ideal.